and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The global business landscape is changing. Now, investors, regulators, and even customers are demanding higher standards for human rights in corporate operations. So in response to this, Malaysia has taken steps to assess its own gaps with its first national baseline assessment on business and human rights. And we are currently in the process of creating our own national action plan on business and human rights. But the question is, will it bring meaningful accountability? And is Malaysia doing enough to align ourselves with global expectations on human rights? So joining me on the show today to discuss this further, I have Dr Pichamon Yeophantong, who is the chairperson of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So welcome to the show, Dr. Yeophantong. Thank you so much for being here with me. You're here in Malaysia. Your visit comes at a very crucial time when we are finalizing our national action plan on business and human rights. We're at, zero draft of this national action plan. And I wanted to ask you to tell me a bit more about your visit here. What are your priorities? What are you looking at?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here in Malaysia. And as you said, it's such a very important time to see this National Action Plan come through. So the reason why I'm here is really to talk about business and human rights, to understand the progress that is being made by Malaysia in relation to advancing its commitments to implementing what we call the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGPs. And importantly, it's also to spotlight key stakeholders that can often be forgotten. And here I'm talking about children in particular. So I'm very grateful to colleagues at UNICEF for having helped to facilitate this visit, but we really also want to be putting a lot of attention to the importance of mainstreaming child's rights when it comes to the broader business and human rights agenda.
Okay, before we get into why it's important for child rights to take center stage, talk to me a little bit about the intersection of business and human rights and the role of businesses in protecting human rights. I think many of us see it as part of ESG compliance. We're very familiar with the term, the acronym ESG by now. Is it the same thing? Do you see it as the same thing?
I would say it's part of the same ecosystem, right? So if we look at ESG, we've now progressed to the point of talking more about business and human rights, or BHR, but ESG is still very much part of that spectrum of progress towards a world where businesses actually uphold and respect their responsibility to respect human rights. So if I were to give you a quick explanation of what the UNGPs are, or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So they were endorsed by the Human Rights Council back in 2011. It was seen as a very momentous occasion because it was the first time that that there was consensus at the global level to ensure that states uphold their duty to protect human rights and that businesses uphold their responsibility to respect human rights. And so when we think about international human rights obligations, we often think about the role of the state as duty bearer, right? But the UN Guiding Principles set out very clearly that businesses have a responsibility too. And so that was a very pivotal moment that has then set the stage for many of the other developments that we now see here in the Asia-Pacific region, including what we are calling the proliferation of national action plans on business and human rights. So it's the guiding principles have come a long way over the past decade. And for the working group, which I'm a part of, our role is to promote, disseminate, and implement the guiding principles to make sure that they become a reality. So that human rights are protected everywhere and for everyone. Okay,
so when we think about business and human rights, more often than not, it's usually in the area of labor. We always focus in on labor rights, and that's part of the ESG strategies we talked about. Child rights rarely take center stage. Why should companies prioritize child's rights as part of their human rights agenda?
That's an excellent question, and I'm so pleased that you asked it, because it's true. When you actually think about it, child's rights are connected to all of the other rights, right? When we talk about labor rights, about ensuring that people get a decent and a fair living wage, if they're parents, then that has implications for their children too. If they can't make a fair living wage, then they can't really look after their family very well. They can't provide for their children in the way that they should. And there are those knock-on effects as a result. So I would say labor rights are very much human rights, child rights are very much human rights. And so we need to see how the dots are connected to appreciate why, you know, talking about children is so important here. I would say that to me it's always quite fascinating but somewhat disappointing when we talk about children's rights in the context of business and human rights, because I'm sure you've come across this before, when people will tell you, yes, children are our future. We have to protect them. We have to make sure that they get everything that they deserve, that they have a healthy planet.
Sang a song about
it. Yeah, exactly. And I'm about to break out into song now. But for your sake and for your viewers' sake, I will not do that. And yet, there's not enough that's being done in relation to how businesses can really safeguard and respect the rights of children who, as we know, have their own distinct individual voices. And I would say that, you know, how we can listen to them is very much a critical part. It's a critical part of all of these conversations, because currently we do not see businesses doing enough to bring children into the room, to actually hear from them what is necessary, what needs to be changed in order to ensure that the rights of future generations are being protected and respected. So that's a very...
What are some of the concerns? What are the areas that you think are being neglected or blind spots when it comes to child rights?
So when we talk about child rights and business, there are the child rights and business principles that UNICEF has spearheaded, and they're very much predicated on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, again, the UNGPs. But if you look at those principles and if you look at the reality that we're in, there are so many millions of children out there who are trapped in enforced labor. And the issue of child labor is but one example of how children's rights are very much impacted by business operations. But if you look further, deeper into the issue, you can also see how, let's say, advertising can really target children as consumers, but it might not be really for want of a better expression, it could be false advertising
or exploitative
advertising that get children to consume, let's say, high-calorie but low-nutrient food products. But it's also about, and here I suppose to go back to the title of your show, consider this. If you are a child and you're working, let's say, in the entertainment industry, and you unfortunately encounter bullying practices, exploitative practices, or even sexual exploitation as a result of the work that you're doing, what recourse do you have to raise your voice? What kind of mechanisms can you actually access right now to ensure that your rights are being protected? And how can you do so independently as an individual with distinct human rights without necessarily having to rely on your parents to assist you in doing so? Do we have those mechanisms in place? Because the guiding principles themselves have 3 pillars. I already mentioned the state duty to protect, the business responsibility to respect human rights. There's also access to effective remedy, and ensuring that children can access justice and effective remedy when harm occurs to them is also very, very important to ensuring that children's rights are being put at the center of discussions
especially if you with the lens of rights, when you think about rights, it implies that there needs to be recourse if those rights are infringed upon.
Yes.
When we think about how to do that, I understand there are gaps in Malaysia's own framework when, in upholding child rights, but what makes for a good framework, based on your experience looking around the world, how can the state provide that framework so that businesses can then respect and there's an avenue for remedy should there be any infringement?
I mean, that is a fantastic question, and one that we are constantly asking ourselves, which I'm sure many stakeholders working in the space are thinking about on a daily basis as well. And in all honesty, the answer isn't a simple one. We know that policy changes, legislative reform takes a lot of time. These are processes that also require political will at the end of the day. And so I would say that before even talking about frameworks that need to be put in place, we first need to raise awareness about the importance of putting children's rights at the center and ensuring that there are, and we can use the guiding principles, the UN guiding principles, as a framework in that regard. Because the UNGPs, as I said, provide a global authoritative framework for what it means for states to create an enabling environment for businesses to respect human rights. There's the children's rights and business principles also. And so if we're building on those international standards and frameworks, I think we can find ways in which to make it relevant to different country contexts, including here in Malaysia.
When you speak to businesses,
yes,
what are they telling you about, what is their response to when you say, please center children's voices when you conduct your business operations? Think about human rights. How do you, what do they say back to you?
So I will name no
No one.
names.
That's fine. We'll keep it anonymous.
I will share candidly here because I want to first acknowledge that there are many businesses out there who are wanting to do more to safeguard the rights of children everywhere. But as I said earlier, the efforts we're seeing tend to be rather superficial.
Right.
So when I speak to businesses, what they often come back to me with, oh, but we're providing scholarships for students. For children to be students.
Okay.
So educational scholarships is one way that we are helping to enhance children's ability to protect their own rights. When I speak with them, they will also say things, oh, we provide funding to schools so that they can provide nutritious meals to students, to children. And all of those things are examples of what we would call corporate social responsibility, right? So positive philanthropic practices that help to enhance the welfare and the well-being of children. But are those efforts enough? And the answer is no. Because if we look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it's very clear that the focus of businesses should not just be on doing good, it's actually about preventing harm. So this is where we need to kind of dig below the surface and actually look at how do businesses' own operations or relationships impact children. And this is where many businesses can't actually give or haven't been able to give me an answer because it means looking also beyond their own immediate operations to what are the implications along their value chains, i.e. supply chains. Are there traces or elements of child labor, for instance? But also looking beyond that, as I said earlier, are parents being paid a decent wage enough so that they can ensure that their kids get to go to
education,
exactly,
well-being,
exactly, or they are assured enough quality time within the family to look after their children too. Because remember examples elsewhere, right, where parents are working such long hours that they don't have enough time to be at home with their children and ensure that their children develop fully into adulthood. So all of these are considerations, and when you think about it deeply, they seem so common sense, but again, it's about connecting the dots and realizing that everything that we talk about in the business and human rights space ultimately can come back to children and their rights.
It would require businesses to do a lot of self-reviewing, self-assessments to look at where their practices may impact children's rights, child rights. Can I ask you how you would respond to businesses who say, well, if I were to enforce human rights, the compliance cost of that will just drive my operational cost upwards and make me uncompetitive in a global market. How would you respond to businesses who feel that way?
I hear that all the time.
I'm sure you do. I hear it too.
We hear it all the time, right? And look, I want to be empathetic here, and I want to also appreciate that for businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, it might seem like a very daunting task to have to undertake what we call human rights due diligence, and that's something that is seen as a necessary process under the UN Guiding Principles to ensure that businesses take stock of what their actual and potential adverse impacts on human rights are. So this process is a complicated one, and it can be time and resource intensive. But it doesn't have to be conducted uniformly by, all businesses in the same way. So basically, if you're a smaller business, your human rights due diligence process might look different from a multinational corporation. But going back to your question, so how do we respond to that? Well, I think there's enough evidence now to point to say that, look, for businesses, if you don't take into account the risk that your operations pose to human rights, that's going to come back and bite you at a later point, because we see how consumers these days are engaging in ethical consumer practices. They want to know that the products and goods that they are purchasing are actually free from child labor, from forced labor, from bad practices, basically. But at the same time, we're also seeing what's known as the mandatory wave, right? So this is referring to developments in other parts of the world, like Europe, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, where there are now actual legal requirements, regulatory requirements for businesses to meet. So I think all of these things taken into consideration, lack of consideration of human rights means that businesses will pay later.
Okay. Well, I like that consumers like us have the power to do something about it, to call out corporations who don't abide by this. But I'm curious to know more about how global trade policies can influence this, because you're absolutely right. Malaysian supply chains are under immense pressure to comply with, or to meet with, standards, international standards on carbon, on the environment, on sustainable practices. How can we, or where do we look to in terms of how global trade policies can influence whether corporations pay attention to child rights?
Well, that is yet another fantastic question. And look, it's a very complex landscape again, because once we get into trade agreements, we know that there are a lot of nuances,
a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts, and the devil is often in the detail, but also a lot of the important work comes afterwards, right? So the actual implementation. So we see some examples recently from free trade agreement that Thailand signed with EFTA states.
Okay.
And in that agreement, there were provisions relating to how businesses and all that need to respect the UN Guiding Principles and related instruments. Okay. So there were explicit provisions about respecting human rights. And I think we're seeing more of that coming into play. And that's one way, I suppose, where we're seeing these trade agreements take into consideration human rights more generally. But whether they explicitly reference children's rights, the answer, I would say, is no, unfortunately, but it goes without saying.
Are you seeing progress, though, on this front?
I think it's safe to say we are seeing progress, indeed. The progress, of course, needs to be more even and consistent across different regions, but at the same time, we are seeing it gradually trickle down. And so in relation to this and other agreements, I think it's safe to say, ultimately, trade agreements aren't just things that get agreed upon by high-level policymakers in a negotiating room, right? The actual people impacted are the workers. It's people like you and me who are consumers too. And so if you think about it, again, these people can be parents. Their children can be impacted indirectly as well if it's a badly formulated trade agreement that has no consideration of human rights. Then, there are big questions that can be asked, whether there can be trickle-down adverse impacts that we can see later on. Okay,
so we're at the stage, in Malaysia, we're at the stage where we're at the zero draft of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And I'm happy to hear that Malaysia is moving in this direction, but action plans often risk being just that, plans. How do we make sure that the country translates this document into real accountability, that there is an actual roadmap for businesses to take, and maybe accountability for them not taking the roadmap?
Absolutely. No, I must say I'm enjoying all of these questions you're asking because they are all topics that are very close to our heart, the work that the working group does. And I would say, yes, that is one of the biggest challenges, right? So implementation on the one hand and enforcement on the other. And you're right, national action plans can exist, but if they're not actually implemented, then they're not going to have the impact that they intend to have. And for the working group, we always say to governments that a national action plan also is a living document. Even if you have one for the next 5 years, you need to constantly update it. You need to look at what are the emerging challenges that might not have been taken into consideration in the previous iteration. So all of these things need to happen concurrently, they need to happen continually, and for any good national action plan, there needs to be clear accountability mechanisms built into the plan itself. So if you have clear commitments, clear indicators for what needs to happen in the next 2 years, 3 years, that is what then will allow governments as well as other concerned stakeholders to be able to monitor progress and ensure that there is accountability in terms of what these plans are supposed to achieve.
Do you think there should be penalties involved? I mean, all of this is voluntary, right? These are all voluntary commitments. And, you know, they're arbitrary lines. The goalposts can be shifted. Do you think there should be any penalties attached to not meeting these commitments?
Well, that is yet another good question.
Do other countries do that?
There are other countries that are doing that. So from the perspective of the working group, we say, you know, if you look at the guiding principles, they're very clear in saying that we need a smart mix of measures. What that means is that we need a mix of both voluntary and mandatory measures at the national and international levels for these to come together so that we're not just predicating every effort on just voluntary measures. There needs to be hard law that comes into place as well. And so we see examples from Europe in particular, like Germany. They have an act in place that helps to enforce human rights due diligence and also has the prospect of penalties included in there so that if businesses don't do what they need to do in relation to human rights due diligence, they are faced with some form of liability. And we see that also in the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, again, the CSDDD.
Yes, okay.
So there are examples that are emerging. And I would say in the Asia Pacific, we haven't quite moved to that stage quite yet, but I know that in certain places, like in Thailand, there has been a lot of discussion around what a mandatory human rights due diligence measure could look like for Thailand, because Thailand's is now on its second national action plan on business and human rights.
That is quite promising. So you've clearly worked on this for a while. You talk about this, look at these issues globally. You mentioned a bit earlier that you are encouraged by promises of progress, signs of progress. What keeps you optimistic to know that there will be progress on this front, particularly potential for real change in businesses censoring child rights? What makes you think there will be positive progress in this and not the unwinding of rights that we've seen in so many different areas and so many different types of rights in other parts of the world?
Of course. Well, I'm very grateful that you are referring to me as an optimistic person.
I hope that's a correct description.
I don't often get called an optimist. But look, there is plenty of reason to be optimistic. I think in terms of global trends, the move towards more mandatory measures on business and human rights is one example of why we should be optimistic. These national action plans, including here in Malaysia, are commendable efforts also on the part of governments to step up their commitment to business and human rights and protecting in particular the rights of those who are most marginalized and at risk. So I think there's cause for optimism, but I would also say that I'm a cautious optimist, right? Because as we've already covered, implementation is really critical here. So even if we get plenty of commitments towards upholding human rights and children's rights, if we don't see follow through, then that's pretty much it. That being said, I will say that in addition to the willpower of certain governments to move the needle in relation to business and human rights, we're also seeing businesses, especially large ones, that are also stepping up and saying we need to do more. And it's to do more because firstly, it matters to their bottom line, but also importantly because it's the right thing to do. As I often like to say, the right way is the human rights way, right? And if you want your business to be sustainable, And I'm thinking here also to Malaysia's ASEAN chair thematic, right? Inclusivity and sustainability. If we want to see that happen for the region, for Malaysia, then we actually need to see human rights being upheld. And I think businesses being an important voice in all of this, they need to also be actively encouraging governments and other stakeholders to pay more attention to business and human rights. And as we were discussing earlier, the rights of those who often are left invisible, including children.
Pichamon, thank you so much for being on the show with me. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching.